What's going on, everybody? It's Alan Thomas, aka Shadow Assassins, and the topic of today is whether or not you can possibly create a story with characters that don't have any weaknesses. What I mean by that is, could you potentially make an extremely overpowered character and still have an interesting story? I do believe it's possible, but I think that takes a bit of tact in order to perform. There are some cases out there, like you look at certain stories in like comic books or whatever, like take Superman for example. Superman doesn't really have many known weaknesses. I think the only obvious one that comes to mind when you think Superman is kryptonite. Other than that, he's pretty much he can take insane amounts of pain, he can take all sorts of punishment, he doesn't really get hurt or take damage. He's actually capable of doing all sorts of crazy feats and whatnot. He can super sight and all kinds of incredible strength and speed. Like, Superman is a very overpowered character, but he does at least have kryptonite. What about characters that have pretty much no weaknesses at all? I actually think about Kenshiro from Fist of the North Star. And I love Fist of the North Star, but I can't think of any weaknesses that Kenshiro has. He pretty much beat the hell out of, well, not all, but the majority of his opponents in the series. He didn't really have a lot of difficulty beating people up, and he will also take insane amounts of punishment and still come back at the end of the day and end up doing some finger pokes and just making someone's head explode. So there are characters out there that exist that don't really have weaknesses at all and they're extremely overpowered. I think about Saitama in One Punch Man too, even though in a sense that's kind of a goof, it's kind of not, but he really doesn't have any known weaknesses either. But some of the intrigue of some of those characters when I thought about them was the actual environment around them has more, I guess, character building and more explanation and in-depth detail than the actual main character does. What I mean is, you'll see a lot of the character development in the story happening with the supporting characters, and the main character would be like the one character in the story who never really changes. Like going back to Kenshiro and Fist of the North Star, there is no real development to his character at all. He is the same. There's no real evolution of his character. But the other characters like Ray and whatnot around him, they sort of go through trials and tribulations, and they sort of have a little character development in the story. And I guess it's a fine line of figuring out ways to make the surrounding story as interesting as possible and giving in-depth details to the supporting cast around the main character if the main character themselves is not gonna really change. And this doesn't mean that they're like not interesting or boring. It's just that they are super powerful or super impressive. They don't really have weaknesses. Now, that being said, I also did an earlier video, which you could probably check out, where I talk about overprotecting your main characters. And that's an entirely different case. Just because you have a character that's overpowered doesn't mean they still can't be in danger. You still can figure out ways, whether they're trapped in something or they have to make a crazy decision or something like that. Like in The Dark Knight, where Batman had to choose between saving the chick's life, whatever her name was, and Two-Face, and he chose Two-Face instead of the girl because he felt that Gotham needed Two-Face more than it needed her, and just let her blow up. Cases like that where you put the hero in a very like tight situation are ways that can help you have a piece of work, whether it's a novel or whatever you're doing, and have a main character who is almost flawless and still put them in vulnerable situations. So I guess that's the main point that I'm trying to get across. You can potentially make a story where not a lot of actual damage is done or even can be done to the main character and still have it interesting, or at least can still have it where there's some type of intrigue or you're watching a weakness or you're watching some type of vulnerability in a character that pretty much has no flaws essentially. Like, there's still ways to make that interesting, even if it may take a little bit of thinking on your part and may be a bit challenging. This only came to mind because I've been watching just old anime movies and old uh, just like cartoons and stuff lately, and I came across Fist of the North Star, and I haven't watched it in a long time. And after a few episodes of watching Kenshiro just beat everybody's ass, it really made me think, like, what weakness does this character have? And he's the main character, and he's just out here slaughtering people. So it is indeed possible to create a story that people actually care about and are into, where the main character really doesn't have a flaw. And to me, because you don't see it that often nowadays, it makes for somewhat of an interesting story. One way to immediately, I guess, stack the deck against the main character who is extremely overpowered is to try to make a villain who is equally as powerful as the main character, and almost put like a little fatal flaw into the villain, in a sense, so that there is an avenue in which the main character can beat him. Just don't make it obvious from the start for the reader or the viewer. But I guess it is possible. Luke Cage is actually a more recent example. It just hit my mind. And Luke Cage has like extremely crazy powers, and I remember the fight he had with his brother in the show, who pretty much had the same powers as him, and he eventually overcame him too. So it is a way to where you can show vulnerability in a character who basically is flawless. And I guess a challenge is just figuring out how you can pull that off, but I do believe it is very possible. And a lot of times, like I talked about in the early video, exact opposite of what I was saying then, but well, no, it's not. I was talking about overprotecting characters and not putting them in dangerous situations. I guess the key to making a story where you have a character and they have no weaknesses, no flaws, and like they just have a whole bunch of gifts and abilities and strength and all this craziness, is figuring out ways to put them in compromising situations. I think that's the best way that you could go about making a story with such a character. But this is just a rant of food of thought to just trigger your brain and thinking in a different way when coming up with your stories and any type of ideas that you were writing for. But it's my little rant for right now. As usual, I'm gonna get back to work, and hope you all have a good day, and I'm out.